Bach Institute, and alongside my colleague Ryan Turner, Associate Director, we have a fantastic group of young musicians with us, working intensively on some of the very greatest music ever written. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome my dear friend, Eric Chafe, who has been a very significant influence on myself and on Ryan in his writings about Bach and his use of harmony and his understanding of theology. And so this is our wonderful chance to bring him in to be a part of our Bach Institute. Eric Chafe is Professor Emeritus of Music at Brandeis University, where he taught since 1982. His primary research areas are the music of J.S. Bach, on which he has published several books and numerous articles, and also Wagner, a book on Tristan and Isolde, and Monteverdi. He has also published on Heinrich Weber, Monteverdi, Wagner, as I mentioned, and he's working currently on a new book on Bach called Thinking with Bach, subtitled Theology, Narrativity, Tonal Allegory, Analysis. And I, for one, am very eager to read this book, but probably we will early in 2024. So keep your eyes open for that. And welcome.
Thank you, Pam. I'm very glad to be here. If you have trouble hearing me at any point, just let me know and I'll use the microphone. When Pam asked me to do this, at that moment, that day, I was thinking about dealing with a chapter in my book that has had a lot to do with dissonances in Bach, and so I mentioned provocative dissonances. When I started writing the book that Pam mentioned, it was just simply called Bach Studies, and I had a file on my computer that said that. And it was chapters on various different aspects of Bach, one of which was entitled Bach's Dissonances. Another was called Bach's Final Cadences. And as the book changed, I changed it to, as it evolved, and I realized that it was impossible to talk about Bach's dissonances in a meaningful way without talking about the pieces in which they were embodied, because Bach thinks that way. They're never just sort of isolated. There's no such thing as emancipation of dissonance in Bach. His dissonances have a context, and they fit within, whether instrumental music or vocal music. They have a purpose which is larger and sometimes extends to several movements. But the fact that Bach thinks that way caused me to change the book from just being titled Bach Studies to Thinking About Bach. And then one day I realized I was using the word trace a lot, so I were tracing Bach's thought processes. And I thought, I think I'll change the title to Thinking with Bach. And I felt that was presumptuous, and I thought about that for a long time, whether I would change it to Thinking with Bach or not. But that's what it is now, and the subject of dissonances or final cadences, and there were several others too, are no longer the titles of chapters in the book. Instead, the chapters deal with compositions and with other features. But the material is still there, but it's worked into a broader context. Bach doesn't, when I mentioned the word provocative dissonances, when Pam asked me for a title, I was thinking of pieces like the ones that I put on your handout, where they are very provocative, and there are quite a lot more. But I was also thinking about subtle dissonances, and Bach has many subtle differences, and they also extend out to not usually to multi-movement context, but to full movement context. And so I decided to not put them here, but I can talk about them after. For example, there are very important dissonances in the first two preludes from the Well-Tempered Clavier, the C major and the C minor. The C major has been written about. It's a subtle difference, but the C minor, the dissonance in the C minor, has probably not been recognized as such in its significance. At least I haven't found it in the literature. When we think of provocative dissonances in Bach, I think a lot of people will think of Cantata 54, Widerstehe doch der Sünde, meaning where you have an E-flat chord with a dominant seventh above it. That's not unusual above a pedal point, but the way it's presented in this cantata means that it's a symbol of resisting sin, and so the singer comes in, has to hold to that E flat no matter what the harmony is doing above it, and that's how Bach depicts resisting sin. It's a fairly local event, so it doesn't spill over into the other important movement in the cantata, the other aria. Or we think of the pitch B natural that appears against the C minor chord that ends the St. Matthew Passion and then resolves into C minor, which I have always viewed as the sting of death being resolved, because you have this dissonance which appears suddenly as a result of the melodic line. You hold it for a certain amount of time depending on who the conductor is, and then you resolve it into the C. And it's as though something painful has been at least partially overcome. There is a premise behind this talk. I think there's more than one, but one that I want to say right at the beginning, which is that Bach's dissonances are rational. They don't come out of nowhere, and they're not thrown in for just to make an effect of some kind. And Bach, in fact, lived in a very rational age, as it's often called the age of reason. And but there was a certain resistance to reason in Lutheranism of Bach's time, and it crops up in 10 Bach cantatas that I wrote about more than 30 years ago in my first book on Bach. And in that context, reason is condemned. And so the 10 cantatas that deal with reason, and there are others that deal with words like Verstand, understanding, or Witz, words in German that can be synonymous with reason, generally treated pejoratively. And there is one cantata that makes a big deal out of treating it pejoratively, and that is, it's an aria called Schweig, taumelnde Vernunft, which is in Cantata 178. And what that means is silence. Taumel in German means something that overcomes you, headiness, conceit perhaps even. And so as the aria begins, you hear the word Schweig on the beat, off the beat, so that it stands out some 10 times before the text even continues. And it's completely against reason. Other cantatas, such as Cantata 121, for example, which is a cantata on the Incarnation, has an aria saying, don't attempt to understand, only accept what God's done. And the Incarnation, namely, that within Lutheran theology is very important. It's one of the central concepts, that God became human in Jesus is something that we could never comprehend. And in the middle of the cantata, we have a recitative that follows the aria that says, don't attempt to understand, and reiterates that message. And in the final cadence of the cantata, it makes it the shift of a tritone in tonality by holding an E sharp in the bass and a B in the melody. And of course, it's C sharp major, C sharp dominant seventh chord, the dominant of F sharp. And Bach changes its function to an F to a B, which means that it fits into the dominant of C major. And the cantata changes its tonality and pivots on that. And then the aria that follows begins with a cello, which from the E above middle C right down to the lowest, the C major arpeggio, right down to the lowest C, while the upper strings leap upwards. And it's an enactment, as the text tells us, of John the Baptist leaping in his mother's womb at the news that Mary was pregnant when she visited her cousin. And so the C major, we have a sudden shift to C major from that. The cantata is the only cantata by Bach that ends on an F sharp major chord, because the chorale that it's based on changed its tonality from Dorian to Phrygian. So in the Gregorian chant melody, that will be from D to E. But in Bach's cantata, the outer movements change from E minor and end on F sharp. And the F sharp sounds like the dominant of E minor. And it's very provocative because the pitch C is retained in both movements until the last minute, especially at the ending of the cantata. So the F sharp major rather, almost seems to come out of nowhere. That would be provocative, but it's not dissonant. The ones that I'm going to talk to you about today have features of both involved in them, that they are dissonant, and the dissonance is used to highlight something which is provocative in a tonal manner. So the first one I'll deal with is O Ewigkeit du Donnerwort, O Eternity Word of Thunder, which is Cantata 60 for the 24th Sunday after Trinity. Right at the end of the church year, you can have up to 27 Sundays after Trinity, but it's extremely rare to have 26 or 27. And so it's right at the end of the year, and at the end of the year, thoughts on death are very prominent. And the cantatas and the readings for those Sundays alternate between fear and hope quite often. And the hope is, of course, that the year will start over again with Advent, which will follow whatever the last Sunday in Trinity, probably the 25th or 24th, and that everything will rotate. But the character of the season that precedes it is beset by doubts and so on. And it's not like the first half of the year, which celebrates events in the life of Jesus. The second half is much more theological and tends to center on torments that individual believers have, and so on and so forth. So that's the context for where Cantata 60 appears. And Cantata 60 is a very deliberate construction by Bach. It's a 5-movement cantata, of which the first to the 4th movements are dialogues. And they're specified in this chorus between fear and hope. And fear is the alto voice. So all these first 4 movements are duets, either as aria duetti, meaning that they're like arias for 2 people, or recitatives that go back and forth between the 2. And the fear is the tenor voice. And through the first movement, the alto sings the chorale melody that begins with the phrase I gave you under the letter A on your handout, O Ewigkeit du Donnerwort, O Eternity Word of Thunder. And the alto sings nothing but that melody. But the tenor, what the tenor sings is the words of Jacob just before he died, when he gathered his sons together It's sometimes known as Jacob's Testament, and it's in German. It's Herr, ich warte auf dein Heil, or Lord, I await your salvation. And in Lutheran theology, the salvation that's awaited would be the coming of Jesus. That is the incarnation. So that would be like, the story of the Star of Jacob, for example, and the associations of Christian interpretations of that passage, which is from the Old Testament, of course. And so in the fourth movement of Cantata 60, hope disappears and fear remains, and the dialogue is no longer between fear and hope. It's between fear and Jesus. And Jesus enters to replace hope, and he sings, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord." Fear of death is the main fear of eternity in this cantata. And then the final movement of the cantata is a famously dissonant movement that you will probably know, and you may even know it from another context. It's Es ist genug, which is the words of Elijah, who prayed to God in the first book of Kings to die. And in the second book of Kings, you know what happens to Elijah. He doesn't die. The fiery chariot comes down, and he's taken up in a whirlwind to heaven without a physical death on earth. And so those words were the springboard for the final chorale that caps this, that ends this cantata after the four dialogue movements. And they arise, of course, from the fourth movement. And so a changing attitude toward death is the subject of that chorale. And the other context you may know it from is the Albenberg Violin Concerto, and where it's mostly transposed to B flat, so a semitone higher than it is here in this cantata. And Berg actually changes it. He makes it less dissonant. He removes the sharpest dissonance that is within that chorale. I'll show you how in a moment. It appears that cantata and that chorale were known in Vienna around that time because Anton Webern, fellow pupil of Schoenberg, conducted a cantata, O Ewigkeit du Donnerwort, and quite a bit of the literature says that was cantata 20 because Bach's chorale cantata on O Ewigkeit du Donnerwort is cantata 20. But it's much more likely that it was cantata 60 because it was known to Berg, and he used it in the violin concerto, but also Oskar Kokoschka, the expressionist painter, did a set of lithographs on that cantata. There are 13 of them, I think, and he used it in an expressionist manner, quoting the texts from Bach's cantata to characterize his relationship with Alma Mahler, which was so tempestuous and disturbing to him that he created this. And he also, so that's also based on cantata 60. But that was done in 1913. But, Berg knew Alma Mahler very well. His wife was friends with Alma Mahler, and so there was a distinct connection there. And probably, I think, cantata 20 was known, and that it's the one that Webern performed. And Berg put it in the violin concerto. And so I have that as C and D are the beginning and ending. The beginning and ending of the chorale are the words Es ist genug, and the beginning is the provocative gesture. But it comes out of reflection by Bach on a broader idea than is contained in the Lutheran idea of eternity. That is, that if we separate the idea of eternity, meaning an afterlife and so on, from Lutheran theology, we can see that it has an equivalent in science. And in science, it would just simply be described as infinity. And so it would mean more to us today, if we're not oriented towards religious values, to think of it as infinity. And infinity was something which, in Bach's time, began to be brought under control in a certain way, meaning that we have numbers like pi and other irrational numbers, which can be called irrational, but also transcendent. And what they point toward is the difference between human life and all its limitations, what we can comprehend. This is very true today as well, and what's beyond human comprehension. And so pi, as I checked on YouTube recently, there are various different numbers according to the date of the YouTube video that's there as to how many decimal points it's been calculated to. And one video actually says more than a quadrillion decimal points with these giant computers linked together to I don't know why anybody would do that, but they did. In Bach's time, it was calculated to many thousands of decimal points already. But the way to do it was by what, the expression squaring the circle. The square is a symbol of earthly life because it's finite. We can calculate its area and so on because we just multiply the sides or a rectangle. With a circle, we can't do that because of the curve. But the area beneath curved forms was also a feature of barely within Bach's lifetime. That is the calculus. Isaac Newton and Leibniz both discovered how to do that. And in 1706, when Bach was in Weimar, an Englishman applied the Greek letter pi as a symbol so that pi could be used in equations and would, of course, remain infinite because it could never be calculated, but could be usable. And even to today, a scientist will tell you that only a small number of the decimal points after pi, no more than 10 at the most, are ever used in calculation. So no calculations in science don't depend on going to a quadrillion or even 1,000 or 100 decimal points. In Bach's time, the closest equivalent in music, which was well known for a long time, were, of course, the result of the difference between the harmonic series, the intervals of the harmonic series, and those that came about as the result of creating systems that were based on perfect fifths. And the perfect fifth is, of course, the first interval of the harmonic series that we hear as a different pitch. We hear the octave, and we think of the octave as the same pitch, or the same pitch class, as we would say, but in a different register. So that it would be a high woman's voice, a medium woman's voice, a tenor, or a bass, and they would all be the note C. But systems were built on G because G could be stacked on top of one another, for example, in the so-called Pythagorean scale. But once you do that, you deviate from the pure intervals of the harmonic series. And so in Bach's time, a series of 4/5, for example, stacked on top of one another, C, G, D, A, E, will give you a major third, but that major third would be wildly sharp in relation to the major third of the harmonic series, and even sharp in relation to what we have on the piano. So one is 380, the pure third is 386 cents in the measuring system, the piano is 400. The Pythagorean stacking of fifths gives you 408. And the difference is known as the syntonic comma. It's a 22-cent difference. It's a fairly high percentage of difference. But if you extend the fifth sequence to, for example, a tritone 6/5 or 12/5 or whatever, you will get other disparate intervals that spell out the difference between an infinite series and what we work with in our lives. And so 12/5 stacked on top of one another will give you the Pythagorean comma. And that's the distance between the starting pitch C and the 12th pitch B sharp. And that appears in countless compositions, and many by Bach. And it will appear in Cantata 182, which I will discuss. It appears, for example, between the first and last fugues in the Well-Tempered Clavier. The first fugue in the Well-Tempered Clavier is based on the medieval hexachord. So in a sense, it's a hexachord fugue. That will be this. Right? Only it's presented this way. The theme of the 12th fugue is this. And it modulates. The first one is contained within the medieval scale. But within the last one, there's your C, and there's your B sharp, and your B sharp makes the modulation part to F sharp. And Bach does that quite a lot. You may know that there's an enharmonic shift in the B minor Mass, for example, in the Credo, and I expect the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. And for the expectation of the resurrection of the dead, Bach changes between B sharp and C. It's very sudden, and the voices go down to low pitch. It's like being buried in the grave. And then suddenly we hear an augmented sixth chord, and the trumpets come in from above, and we're in another world altogether. So Bach does things like that. They may be dissonant or they may not be dissonant. That passage has some dissonance in it, but not a biting dissonance like we have in Cantata 60. If you look at my first example, what it will show you is that Bach, throughout the course of the cantata, modifies the chorale melody by augmenting the intervals, by changing the G sharp to a G to a G sharp in the first half of the phrase, and the A to an A sharp. And in other words, he's moving beyond the pitch framework of the chorale. And that's the first recitative, and he calls it O schwere Gang. A gang is a step or a progression, and schwer is heavy or difficult, meaning that the path through life is difficult, the path to eternity. And then the last four notes of the chorale have an alteration from D to D sharp. And we have the tritone, which is another irrational set of intervals. That is, it's all whole tones. Whole tones are traditionally always express the division between fifths. C, G, D. C, D is a whole tone. C, G, D is 2/5. And so the tritone is made up that way. But so the fifth distance is quite large, but the whole tone difference is more contained. And it tends to shift the key of the piece. This chorale was written in the 17th century, and to my knowledge, and I've thought about this for a long time, nobody other than Bach in the Baroque used that chorale in a cantata or in a chorale book without changing those first four notes. Even Telemann in his chorale book of 1730, which lists multiple variants of the chorale melody, does not include this original one. So the versions will be A, B, C sharp, C sharp, A, B, C sharp, D natural, B, C sharp, D sharp, but no tritone. And, and what Bach does with it, of course, is extraordinary, and it relates to what happens throughout the cantata, where we have several times whole tone relationships. That is, modulations from F sharp to E to D, or vice versa, which are very unusual to find in music, and that is what underlies the beginning phrase of this chorale. And then I'll tell you what Alban Berg did with it. So the beginning phrase is this. This is the words, es ist genug, it is enough. Meaning, I'm fed up with life, I've had it. That's what the beginning is saying. And the dissonance, of course, is this. It's a whole tone progression after the first chord. So we have A, and then we have an E6 chord, and then we have an F sharp 6 chord, and then we have a G sharp 6/5 chord. So E, F sharp, G sharp in succession. The recitative that leads into this polarizes D and G sharp. It actually has a cadence in G sharp. And so Bach is not pulling this harmonization completely out of the air, let's say. He's not doing it without thinking of the rest of the cantata. So what we have is this. But this, on the beat, is an accented passing note between the E and the C sharp, and Berg made it an unaccented passing note. He moved the D sharp to the previous beat. So instead of having D sharp, C sharp on the fourth beat of that measure, he had ED natural rather, ED natural on the second beat, and so it sounded like this, which is much less distant. But the chorale is very expressive, and as it goes on, it will have before the end, it will have a chromatic phrase that precedes the final Es ist genug, which we hear twice. And that's my example D on the handout. And it's a very elaborate conception there too, with some dissonance, but not like the opening. But the purpose of the D sharp is the cantata's in D major up to the end of the fourth movement. And the last notes in the fourth movement are these four. So that's with the D natural, and then the chorale comes in and changes it immediately. And the purpose of the G sharp 6/5 chord is that in any hexachordal framework or the old scale, the sharpest degree you have is the mediant degree. And this G sharp is the mediant degree of E, which is the dominant of A, which is the dominant of the key of the cantata. So in order to establish a very secure change of key from D major to A major at the end, Bach harmonizes this with a G sharp chord, which means that when we hear the endings of the phrases that follow, the E will be tremendously secure. And the E being that secure makes the A very secure at the end. And so the final two in what I've numbered D, the final two phrases, they invert the beginning phrase of O Ewigkeit, as the first phrase modified it by changing the D to a D sharp. The last phrase makes the direction go downward, and the final cadence brings the D back. And the D natural, the chorale wavers between D sharp and D natural, but the final phrase, the final phrase is this. Sorry. And there's your D natural, and it sinks into the C sharp, and everything is resolved. Can we hear that one now? the cantata is more complex than I can indicate here, but just enjoy the dissonance.
Oops. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Wait. Nope, stop. I'm sorry about that. Leaning on the wrong thing. I had it all set up. There we go. Okay, now we're trying again.
Listen to this phrase here that's coming. So the words "es genug" change their meaning from the beginning of the chorale to the end. They're fearful, we could say, at the beginning, and dissonant, and comforting at the end. Okay. Let's turn to another cantata that has an equally striking dissonance within it. This is Cantata 182, written quite a bit earlier. About more than 10 years earlier, when Bach was in Weimar in 1714. And it's an 8-movement cantata, of which 1 and 2 and 7 and 8 are in G major. And the 4 movements that come in between move from C major through E minor through through 2 in C major, and then 1 in E minor and 1 in B minor. And I've given you the C major recitative because it's completely based on circle of fifths motion, and it has no accidentals. And it refers to something that is very interesting in this particular cantata, because I think for the only time in Bach's life, 2 feasts of the church year fell on the same day. And the cantata is traditionally viewed as for Palm Sunday, which is before Easter. It's Jesus' entry into Jerusalem for the Passion and Holy Week and so on. And the crowd celebrated him as though he were a king and threw palm branches along his path. And the text of this recitative is a paraphrase from one of the Psalms, and it says, "See, see, I come. In the book it was written of me. Your will, my God, my God, my God, your will I do willingly. Your will I do willingly." And I've marked with an asterisk how the circle of fifths dominates the melody, as well as it's an endless circle of fifths rotating pattern, diatonic rotating pattern in the bass. And so Palm Sunday on fell on March 25th in 1714. But March 25th is a fixed date in the church calendar. It's the date of the Annunciation to Mary from the angel, of the birth of Jesus. And so we have 2 different things in here, and this recitative is more it can be, see, I'm coming in the book, it's coming into Jerusalem for the Passion, but it's also coming into the world. And so Bach moves to the subdominant and gradually moves through a series of arias that follow a particular interpretive pattern until in the last of the arias, before the return to G major, we are in B minor. And B minor is the sharpest key of what was known as the ambitus of G, and C is the flattest. They're the semitone within the scale of G. G, A, B minor, C major. And so Bach traverses that distance. That's quite common for him to do, by the way. It's a lot of pieces do this, something like this. In example 2B, I've given you measure 37 to 45, I think, of the middle of the B minor aria. And in that area, we move the furthest distance up till that point, away from the C major of the first one. So it's dealing with the end of the incarnation, the crucifixion. But it's applying it to the believer who sings. And so it's the text at the point that I quoted for you is Schreit die Welt nur kreuzige. Even if the world calls out crucify, you have to hold to your faith and so on. And so Bach depicts the word crucify with a long, long melisma, as you can see from measure 40 to 43, 40 downbeat to 44. And the music is moving toward the dominant of F sharp. That is the dominant of the dominant in B minor. It's much sharper than where we started out, okay? But as it reaches the end of the word kreuzige in 43, you can see that the bass is on a B sharp. And that B sharp is going to resolve in 44 up to C sharp, and we will be on the C sharp major chord, which is the dominant of F sharp, which is the dominant of B. But what Bach does to depict the word kreuzige, as it approaches the C sharp, in the second last measure, in measure 44 of my example, he's now this is okay. We know what that is. That's the dominant of F sharp. But this if we interpret this as a C, which we can't do, because the context means that it is definitely a B sharp and not a C. But if it were a C, it would be a C with a G above it, and it would seem illogical in this context to have that. But if we take that chord, we could say, oh, it's an augmented sixth chord you know, but it isn't. It's a Neapolitan harmony. That is, it's that will be the harmonic progression we would expect. So what Bach has done is to make a very sharp pitch in the bass and a flat one. But that flat one happens to be the key of the cantata, G. And he writes no figures in the bass. So we can't say whether he intended it to be harmonized or not. And I listened to some recordings, and I watched the one by Rudolf Lutz, which is on YouTube, and he's one of my favorite Bach conductors for sure. And he doesn't harmonize the bass note. But some people do harmonize it, and the question is what do you harmonize that B sharp with? In 1950, William Scheide, who founded the Bach Aria Group, which was still very much alive when I was teaching at Stony Brook in the late 70s, and Sam Barron, a famous flute player, had taken it over. And but William Scheide sometimes attended, and he wrote an article about that, and he said he felt it should be harmonized with this. Right? And that it should have a harmonization, which means that at that point it would be. So it would be the most, that I think is probably the most biting dissonance in Bach's music that I can think of, if you harmonize it like that. And we don't have an answer. But the Lutz recording makes something out of it, but it doesn't harmonize it. And other people don't harmonize it. And I've discovered that in performances of Bach, that it's routine to kind of play down these dissonances. The older ones are more sensitive than the newer ones tend to play it down more. And the next one that I'm going to give you, which is the second movement of Brandenburg Concerto number 1, has a very rational series of dissonances. And some of the early music groups, the Koiken, for example, attempt to pretend that it's not there, that the dissonance is not there, and to eliminate it. Some give you it, and we'll hear it in a moment, but what I want to point out to you is that you're going to hear it in Benjamin Britten's performance, and he does kind of, it's clear that he understands that there's a dissonance there, and he's not trying to cover it up. He doesn't emphasize it. I don't believe it should be emphasized. The movement, the concerto's in F major, but the movement begins and ends on an A major chord. So it's a major third. It's the major chord on the third of the degree of the scale, which would be the Phrygian mode if we thought of it as Phrygian, or a Phrygian cadence, which would be, say we're in F major, and the Phrygian cadence would be this. And Bach ends the cantata by doing this, making an augmented. The augmented sixth chord for Bach is always an extension of the Phrygian cadence. It's always it may function like it does in the classical period where, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven use it in every piece practically. It's so common. In Bach, it's not common, and it comes out of this context. But the slow movements of other Brandenburg concertos, most of them, in fact, end on a Phrygian cadence. And if you know number 3, it doesn't have a slow movement. It only has a Phrygian cadence. So this movement can be considered an expanded version of a Phrygian cadence, that is, A major as the correct final pitch for the piece. But the piece has a middle section in which we have A minor and D minor, which give us the tonal context for the A, that it's the dominant of D minor. But the beginning of the piece, if you look at it, it turns the A very, very quickly into the dominant of D minor. So already before bar 2 is underway, as soon as we hear the first B flat or a G, we know that the A is a dominant function and that we're moving toward D minor. And the oboe plays a line that brings that out. And then in measure 4, you can see that as that slowly downward moving decorated line comes back to A, that the G is in the bass, and the G moves to F, to E, and to D. And so in measure 5, we're on D minor, and the A has been turned into the dominant of B, or identified precisely. And the violino piccolo comes in at the 5th, or at the 4th, I guess. It's a 4th higher, but at the 5th, if you think of it in tonal terms, in D minor, and plays the same thing for one measure to D minor, then changes to D major, the last measure on the page. And that becomes the dominant of G minor. So we're moving by circle fifths from this initial A to D minor toward G minor. And we have the same pattern exactly, and we have the fifth descent on page 2 of that example, from D on the first measure to C, B flat, A, G in the second. And at that point, Bach changes the pattern and gives us a cadence pattern in G minor. Right? And the cadence pattern in G minor means that as we get to that point, we're doing this. And then with the winds and strings alternating, but the theme now moves into the basso continuo. Note is that? You don't have to have special ears. You can look at the score, but pardon? Pardon? G sharp? I don't think so. It's an A flat. Because the one thing we know that has to do is do it because we've been moving to C minor. But before that measure is over, that gives it away. That's where it changes to a G sharp. It starts as Bach writes it as a G sharp, but it is an A flat at the beginning. And what has happened is the explanation for this, I'm tempted to ask you for an explanation, but I think I'll give you mine, is that what Bach is doing is he's saying, oh, we're moving from A minor, A major, dominant D, I move to D, and I'm moving to G. When he gets to G, he provides the cadence, but the cadence is dissonant with the melody that is moving on to C. So the upper parts are doing this, which is still G minor. But that A flat gives away that it's C minor. The theme, it's the flat sixth, and it pushes the tonality towards C minor. So we have the collision of two keys, one of which hasn't completely ended, but the other has already started. And the A flat belongs to the one key, and the A natural and the F sharp belong to the other key. And you know, it's dissonant, but I think with all these dissonances, what really impresses me about it is that our ears sort it out. Our ears are not bothered by all this. We think, oh, this is an expressive moment, but we don't say this is a wrong note. And I don't think it's necessary to play it down at all. Bach does this at 3 different points in the movement. So he does it at 3 different pitch levels with the same effect until at the end he works toward the final cadence. And as the final cadence comes, he lands, instead of going to D on the final cadence, the D minor, he gives us the B flat, and then, and then the winds and strings jockey back and forth with harmonies that sound very disparate. That is, we have a B flat chord, we have an E major chord, we have an A minor chord, we have an F sharp diminished chord, which will be like D major in that context. And then we have a G, and that G finally gives away to the A where we started, and we're back. And that has to be confronted with the F as it was at the beginning to the previous F. And the Phrygian effect will be on both ends of the movement. Let's hear how Benjamin Britten does it. This piece is this concerto is the first Brandenburg concerto, the only one I knew when I was a kid, and I loved it. And all I could think, but I didn't have any technical language to describe what was happening in there. I just thought, oh, this is very expressive, you know. That's I think the way most people think of it. That Bach is in fact doing things that seem quite unorthodox and that many people couldn't handle very well, probably, but but there's a rational process behind it, and the process is that there's the overlap of two keys, and so the pitches that make the dissonance, some of them belong to the old key, and some of them belong to the new key, or the melody of the new key. I have one further example that I won't spend a lot of time at, and it's a recitative from the St. Matthew Passion. And I included the preceding recitative so you would get an idea of where it comes. It comes at the judgment of crucifixion. And that is the 50E at the top of the page. And it is in E minor, which is generally the key. It's the key that the Passion begins in, and it's the most important key for the Passion as a set of adversarial events, let's say. But Bach at various points confronts the key of E minor with flat modulations that are meditative and that are separated in a sense from what happens. And the greatest of them is when the key of E minor comes to an end deep in part 2. And it's when Jesus has been crucified, so it's Golgotha. And Golgotha is, of course, a symbol for a turning point, because it's the place of the skull, but in Lutheran theology, or all Christian theology, it's the place of redemption. And the victory over death rather than just the symbol of death. And so at where the E minor comes to an end, we have that E minor, and there's a little bit more that I'm going to play in a second, and it's giving the reason from the crowd why Jesus was crucified, because he called himself the Son of God. And so this is then hat gesagt, he said, and then Bach does. Then there has to be a change of perspective, and so Bach does this, and the text is, the same thing was said by the murderers who were crucified with him. And it changes to C minor. Well, that's not the one that I gave you. The one that I gave you has a dissonance. And I'll just highlight that for you, and then you can ask questions if you like. If you turn to the last page, example 4, the metaphor in this is hardness versus softness, which in medieval music theory and still in Bach's time would be the words durus and mollus. And today they mean major and minor in Germany. And Germany is the only country, I think, on earth that uses dur and moll for major and minor. But for many years, even from ancient Greek theory, they meant hard and soft. And that's been thoroughly investigated. And in Bach's time, that was still alive. So sharp keys were described as the hard keys, and the flat ones as the sharp, as in the example that I just played you. Well, in this one, the text on the page that I gave you is actually it's earlier. It says on the previous page, erweichet euch, that's soften. Erweichet euch der Seelenschmerz, doesn't your heart soften at the sight of such torment. And you can see that this is very much in sharp key region. And then the next line is, ah, yes, you have a heart that must be like a martyr's Säule. If anybody here has been in Vienna, there's a martyr's Säule on the Graben in Vienna. It's a stone monument. And that's what being, not that particular one, but one like it, that's being compared here, of a stone statue of a martyr who is bound to be, whipped or have arrows shot through him or whatever, a martyr in a stone column. And so the text is saying your heart must be harder than that. And even much harder, noch viel härter sein, even harder than that. And then it says, erbarmt euch, halte dein, have mercy, stop. And at the end, you can see in the last two measures before the final cadence, we are moving toward the dominant of F sharp, somewhat as we did in the earlier cantata. And so noch viel härter sein has a brief C sharp while against the B sharp of the strings, which are very aggressive at that point. And they settle on C sharp. And then as it crosses the bar line for have mercy, the C sharp moves down to a C, which could be a B sharp, depending on what follows, but is actually a C here, because there's an enharmonic shift between the D sharp and the E flat in the second last measure, and suddenly the harmony in the affect changes from F sharp minor to G minor. And the aria that follows will be a meditative aria in G minor. And it's the individual inserting himself in the passion, saying, if only that, that my tears could overcome this, blah, blah, blah. And so it's a response of compassion and sympathy. And Bach, the dissonance is not very pronounced, but if you listen to it carefully, the strings are doing this. And they're doing also this. And while they're doing this, the voice is in the same register. It's very hard to do. I'll take it down an octave. You hear that again? It's very, very briefly on the beginning of the word harder. So the dissonance goes along with the enharmonic shift here to change the perspective. And the perspective changes from the physical event, which is horrific to look at and so on, to compassion and a wish that it could be alleviated in some way. That's the last example that I want to discuss. I have a catalog, or sort of a catalog of instances like this in Bach, where Bach does this. They're always rational. They are sometimes not provocative, like these, and they are always expressive. And I don't really find them in other people's music from the time. Handel doesn't do it. Handel does do it on occasion, but not in the same way. Oh, we didn't do that example, did we? No, I didn't bring that example, did I?
Oh, what, the same method? Yes.
Oh, yeah, I did.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
which
Oh, sorry. Yes,
we should
it's
hear it.
yeah, you can hear it. Yes, it's. Disc 3, band 14. I'm sorry, I should have told you that before.
That's all right.
And band 14, I think, will be the beginning of this example that I have there. Okay, that's all I have to say. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer or try to, or comments on
Any
it.
questions? Wesley?
Yes.
Do you mind if I move my master?
Yeah, and you can stand up too.
A second so I can more clearly speak. To what extent do you think Bach used the convention of affects in keys and their use before him and during his time to portray certain emotions versus what he brought to it and made his own through keys? I'm just curious about how he thought about his relation to other people's view of the affects.
Yes. I think Bach was very cognizant of especially traditional elements. And so in this book, and in an article years ago, I've expanded it for this book, I dealt with the Bach canons and how Bach sometimes puts a title on canons as to what they're representing. And they deal with a wide spectrum of tonal language. For example, there's a canon on the triad. It doesn't have a text other than the triad. But there's a canon on the opposition of affect involved in the meaning of the cross, for example. It's called Christus coronabit crucigeros, or Christ will crown the cross bearers. And it's based on the ground bass, which is half of the ground bass of the Goldberg variations. And the first half of the piece is very sorrowful because he's using the lamenting pattern that was associated in opera with laments, that, right? And so the bass is, and so the first half, which would be the cross bearers, would be this. Sorry. And then repeat it. The harmony, the piece is in G, but the harmony to C minor. So it's a secondary dominance as it rises. As it sinks, it's circle of fifths progression, the F sharp major minor, changing to the dominant of E, changing to E minor, changing to the dominant of D, A, and then to D minor, changing to B diminished, dominant of C minor, and then reversing as it goes up. And so it's two different affects. And the ascending part is because the harmonies are changing from minor to major rather than major to minor, even though they're in sequence and not defining all those individual keys, is a nod in the direction of a traditional means of indicating lamentation. But he puts his own twist on it. I think Bach was very cognizant of old music theory, for example, and so he writes a canon on the old catchphrase mi fa et fa mi est tota musica, and somebody else, a theorist from within Bach's lifetime, had written a treatise on that. It's called Ut Re Mi Fa Sol La. And in it, he calls it tota musica, all of music. And the way we would read that today is tendency tones, I think. Mi and fa, that mi goes in one direction, fa in the other, and it can be extended out. And but Johann Mattheson, for example, in a treatise called it Tote Musica, T-O-D-T-E, dead music. Psalmization in this way of thinking was dead for Matheson. He was kind of iconoclastic and more deliberately modern in his outlook than Bach. I think Bach retained numerous features of traditional affect and thought about it quite a lot. And the fact that he puts them in canons means that they're kind of like microcosms of how his language works. The most interesting, but they're not often, this is a point that I make in my book a lot, they're often not what we would automatically think they are. So I'm sure you know the musical offering and the theme of the musical offering. And when Bach presented a dedication copy to Frederick the Great, he had it printed on special paper, different from all the other copies. And he had, in the margin, 2 of the canons have inscriptions. And one of them is a canon that has augmentation. He says, as the note values increase, so may the glory of the king, or something exactly like that. And the other one is a modulating canon, and it moves upward by whole tones through C minor, D minor, E minor, F sharp minor, G sharp minor, B flat minor. It has to be an enharmonic change until it gets an octave higher. And the theme of the musical offering, as you know, is this, and it suggests anything but glory, and it's lachrymose, if anything. It's this. But for this canon, Bach changes the cantus firmus, the given melody, so that it modulates to D minor, and that's very easy to do, and then puts 2 canonic voices against it, so that it moves up a tone for the second, and then up another tone, and so on, and so he changes the theme. And on the way down, he just syncopates it, so that you don't think of the rhythm so much. Instead of, he goes, and there's where it changes. And then he does the same thing, moving from D minor to E minor. And I don't think that there's a joke involved in there, that he's writing a sorrowful piece. By the way, the augmentation and diminution is all at low pitch, and it's full of suspended dissonances, and it's also lachrymose. I think that Bach is making a theological message, that we're all human beings, we all die, and that, he wasn't trying to insult Frederick the Great, I think, by having a secret message of death, and then contradicting it with what he wrote in the margin. I think he's thinking completely of that Frederick is mortal like everybody else. And he's wishing him life and the best of wishes, but what he's producing in this rising thing, the rising pattern on its own does not turn happy or ever become like that. The canonic voices are really interesting because there are 2 of them and they answer at the 5th. That means that as the theme begins in C minor, one of the canonic voices is in C minor, but when the second one comes in, it comes in G minor. And then as they move to the D minor version, you have D minor and A minor. And so it means that he goes through the entire minor key cycle within the octave. It's not keys. The keys are the 6 keys of the whole tone relationship. But like all scalar motion, behind it lies circle of fifths motion. And I think he's making that statement. And I think he makes it in virtually every piece in some way or other. He understands it, but there are many pieces where it stands out on the surface. And it comes out of traditional theory. it's a wonderful canon. I don't always think of it as sorrowful, and it's not possible to think of it as happy or projecting that kind of emotion, I don't think, because the theme itself forbids that. That may not be the answer, a good answer, but it's some thinking about it anyway.
Are there any other questions for Professor Chafe?
Sure. You talked a lot about all these amazing rationalities in dissonances, and I'm wondering if you've done any work that's I'm going to ask coming up in your book to talk about stringing rationalities together to create a musical rhetoric of sorts, as far as creating the different types of dissonances representing a different form of argument in Bach's music, as far as maybe intervallic relationships or something to that effect.
I'm not sure I understand your question perfectly, but
I mean,
could you explain it a little more?
Yeah, I mean, if maybe different intervals used in Bach's melody writing, or in that sort of sense, and if the music, if the way that those melodies, or the way that those intervallic relationships are written, are they meant to suggest something rhetorically without, to enhance the text that Bach is writing?
He definitely does do all kinds of things with particular intervals that have traditional meanings, for example, and you know, one of the most famous is the so-called Kreuzstab cantata, and where the thing, you know, where this, the B flat to C sharp, we would think of as a cross relation. There are many of those, of course, at different types in Bach, but also the sharp sign was a cross symbol too. So that's an instance of an interval. One that I've studied in detail is the I wanted to deal with instrumental music in this because I've written so much about you know, cantatas and passions, and that I wanted to deal with the fact that not long after Heineken published the first diagrammed version of the circle of keys in Western European theory, Bach must have begun the well-tempered clavier, and he had a son who is now 10 years of age. And so 2 years before he produced the first book of the well-tempered clavier, he produced a notebook for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, and there are 11 of the first 12 preludes are contained in that, and the revisions to them and the things that he does are remarkably interesting, and it got me interested in writing about some of the preludes and fugues. And so one, for example, that I love, that I wrote a great deal on, is this. Now that theme is a cross theme because it has a cross relationship between the B and the E. And you know in the St. Matthew Passion it's La, Si, and that interval, it also is Bach modifies the chorale that begins Cantata 61, Nun kommt der Heiden Heiland, which, you know, but he changed it. And I think it's a deliberate gesture, but with this one, it's a very special fugue, 5 parts, the longest and one of the most famous in the well-tempered clavier. And I think with pieces like that, you often, and like with the Brandenburg Concerto No. 1, you often suspect that there's an agenda behind it. Not that we ever want to start thinking of Bach in terms of program music, but that he sometimes does seem to have something concrete. The first Brandenburg Concerto, the first movement of that he used to introduce a cantata called Falsche Welt dir traue ich nicht, false world, I don't trust you. It doesn't mean he was condemning his own music or association with the falseness of the world. He's saying this is this kind of splendor of the world that leads the faithful astray. And so the modulation in the recitative that follows is to B flat minor and so on. And so that movement was used in that particular context. The slow movement I don't think he used anywhere else, but the last movement he used in the cantata called Vereinigte Zwietracht. And over the course of that concerto, the violino piccolo comes out to be the primary soloist. It plays only a bar and a half or so in the first movement. It completely doubles the first violin, doesn't have any reason to be there, but it's notated in D major because it sounds a minor third higher than it's written. It doesn't belong to the orchestra, and it can't be heard as a separate voice. In the dissonances, in the slow movement, it's the highest part, and so it comes out into its own. In the last movement, it's completely the soloist. It's the dominant soloist. It plays quadruple and triple stops. The first violin doesn't get anything like that. And so it's like this person that doesn't belong to the orchestra becomes the most important, but yet its sound is very feeble. And Bach uses it to culminate ritornelli. You have a big ritornello with all the instruments, and for the final phrase, he reduces it to basso continuo and violino piccolo. Has to playing quadruple stops and things. It has to carry the weight of the whole thing. When he arranged it as a cantata, it's believed, by the way, that movement in the concerto came from an earlier lost work, but that's not a certainty. All we know for sure is that he arranged that movement in this cantata. The entire chorus parts of that cantata are derived from the violino piccolo, not from anything else. So he's saying this is a polyphonic part, this instrument that doesn't belong, that has a fairly feeble sound, it gets nothing to do in the first movement. And none of the other instruments has a solo on its own. But the violino piccolo plays with the first horn, with the first oboe, and with the first solo violin. They don't play on their own. Only the violino piccolo does. And so it does seem like, also there's a theme that Bach didn't invent in the first movement anyway. The horn theme is a traditional call. It seems like, that's why I put narrativity in the subtitle to my book, that there's some pieces that do seem to have a logical, rational kind of analog. You're not going to make up a story about it, but music can't be precise, but you can imagine different kinds of stories, a religious one or a social one, that the violino piccolo is somebody who is at the court of Curtin and never gets to say anything. And who finally comes into his own, and all the others have to listen in the last movement, which they do. And so I think the Bach has things on his mind sometimes that we don't know about. He never wrote it down, never gave us any clues.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has really been
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed doing this. And
You've given us a lot to think about, and I hope that all of you will come to some of our other public events. Next, we have our open cantata rehearsal tomorrow in the sanctuary for Cantata 65, and our fellows will be participating in that rehearsal and performance on Sunday. And then Monday evening, we will be back here with a very special masterclass featuring our singers and our keyboard player, looking at some of these St. Matthew Passion ariosos, and really getting into what is this very special type of movement that Bach uses so expressively in the St. Matthew Passion. So I hope you'll join us for that. Wednesday night we have a Pamela panel discussion with the manual musicians. Why do we play Bach on modern instruments? And I hope you'll join us for that. And then Friday night, we have another lecture, Wendy Keller, speaking about listening to the female voice in Bach cantatas. So we have some wonderful events, and we hope